Thanks for having me here today. I'm the head of the Sustainable Buildings Group for Jacobs across Australia. I'm based in Melbourne, so you can blame me for what is apparently horrendous weather in Perth. Fly to Melbourne with me tomorrow and you'll see it's not too bad here. But what I just wanted to talk about today was some interactions between tools, predominantly Green Star and the IS tool. Most of my work is in the building space, but as infrastructure projects become more and more complex and include built form components, conditioned spaces, we start to see more of a greying of the boundaries between these two tools, and I just wanted to touch on some of that today, and hopefully it starts some interesting conversation later. So I'm just going to run through sustainable rating tools for buildings and infrastructure, talk a little bit about the development of the two tools, and talk about some of the comparisons between them and where they start to interact in terms of project boundaries and how we govern and administer those tools, and also who owns those ratings. And I'm keen to learn from you guys today to immerse myself more in the IS space, but also to hear about how these tools are being administered on your projects and what issues or boundaries you guys are having as well. So it's important to note that as sustainability professionals, we definitely don't condone that rating tools are needed for good sustainability outcomes, and hopefully you guys are seeing that over here. And it's interesting to hear not just what's happening in WA, but also from Liz's presentation, what's happening further abroad. But what a rating tool like IS or Green Star or any other rating tool does for us as sustainability professionals is it provides us with a common language, a really clear guidance framework, and an understanding those project objectives. So right through a project, we have a lot of real estate at a table. If value management or project desires try to change, we've got a framework that allows us to try and maintain some robust sustainability outcomes in our projects. So that really helps us. But it's really important with that any tool that you're administering is really taken up and integrated into the project team and the design team from the project's outset right through to that project's post-completion operation. So we need that full client buy-in to what those objectives are. And hopefully you guys are having those discussions, whether you're a client looking for a consultant team or whether you are a consultant looking to get on board with a client to really understand what that project's objectives are, what its drivers are, and understand how to try and best deliver on those outcomes, whether it's through a rating system or not. So the tool I'll focus on today is the IS system, which you guys are working with here, and also Green Star. Now I've put up there the Green Star design and as-built tool. How many here have worked with Green Star? Do we have any Green Star accredited professionals in the room? Just a couple, yeah? So I'll talk a little bit about some background of the Green Star rating tool as well as the development of the IS tool. But this can also apply to the other Green Star tools as well. So there's Green Star Communities, which deals with precincts. That also has some close interactions with the IS tool, and you guys might have seen that if you're delivering any infrastructure projects that happen to be within any large urban renewal or greenfield site developments as well. So let's talk a little bit of history about some green building rating tool development. It really started back in the 90s and the early 2000s with BREEAM. BREEAM's a UK system, taken up through the UK and right throughout Europe. Later on in 2000, LEED came into play. That's the US system. Green Star was first delivered in Australia in 2002. It's since then had a number of different versions from when it was incepted right through till now. What we then of course saw in 2010, the IS rating system was first developed and launched in 2012. Why this timeline is important is because the IS system is still young, it's still new, it will still go through many evolutions, and we've already seen that occur in the last few years. So it'll be interesting to see where that tool ends up, what the market demands in terms of the shifting of the IS tool, where benchmarks will sit, and how that tool is actually taken up by the industry. Just to give you an idea of the scale of some of these tools, although Green Star's been around for about 15 years in Australia, they just announced, I think, their 700th building that was certified under Green Star. There's another couple of hundred in registration and going through the application process under Green Star. LEED has a number of tens of thousands of buildings certified under LEED, and a number of thousand of them are currently registered for certification in North America predominantly. LEED's starting to pick up in Australia as well. We have some international clients demanding LEED certifications for stadiums, retail outlets that might be US based, or even commercial tenancies that might be US based as well. BREEAM takes over all of Europe, so BREEAM has about 250,000 projects certified and about 150,000 registered throughout Europe. So that's really the largest of the lot. But it's interesting to see how these tools will continually be expanded. Obviously Green Star is also in New Zealand too, so it's interesting to hear how that's growing in that space as well. For those that aren't familiar with how the Green Star tool has developed, since it was launched, there were a number of tools relating to different facility types or the functional use of those buildings. So there was an office one, a retail one, education, healthcare, residential. It was then decided in 2014 that was way too confusing. We needed one tool to rule them all, so Green Star Design and As-Built was launched. What that also did that was really important for Green Star is it got rid of the ability for projects to apply only for Green Star design rating. That really caused a fair bit of conflict within the community, that projects could launch and get certified under Green Star design, but there was no follow through that actually had to happen in construction. So now under Green Star Design and As-Built, projects must receive both a design and an as-built component to their project, which is the same as what happens with IS, and that's what should happen with all rating tools really, to ensure that what's actually delivered on the ground and what customers and building users will receive is actually what was designed by the design team. So Green Star Design and As-Built sits within the full Green Star suite of tools, which includes, as I said, the Green Star Communities rating tool that looks after large-scale precincts. So that's really interesting for us to work on some large precincts in Victoria that are really looking at precinct-scale infrastructure. So whether it's water treatment systems, precinct-scale energy generation systems, or renewable energy systems, we really get some efficiencies in delivering some of that infrastructure over a wider area. We've then got Green Star Interiors that deals with fit-outs of buildings, and Green Star Performance, which is our operational rating tool. Within the IS development, as we said, version 1.0 came out in 2012. I think it was at this conference last year that 1.2 was launched with some updates and pending the version 2, which should be later this year, maybe early next year, for when that one gets finalised. I think Jacobs is part of some of the development of those new credits. So we've got some major updates and some new categories, and really that comes back to that timeline I was talking about earlier on, where this tool will continually evolve, benchmarks will change. Obviously the first driver of launching a new tool within the industry is to make sure you get that industry uptake, and we've got a number of clients in the room here that have really adopted the IS rating system as part of their ethos as how they deliver business and how they do work. Now it's really up to ISCA to try and continually drive that change and that adaptation of that tool to make sure it's really pushing world's best practice in infrastructure delivery. So both the IS tool and Green Star adopt a whole-of-life aspect to projects, whether it's infrastructure or buildings, right from the design to the as-built, the construction, and the operational performance of those facilities. So that's really important. Let's just have a look at some more details of the tool comparisons between the IS tool on the left and the Green Star tool on the right. There's quite a few similarities, which is great. They're both heading in the same direction. They're complementary tools, which is exactly what we want to see, because they're going to be interacting more and more as we see infrastructure projects delivered. We heard Anthony talk at the start about the quadruple bottom line, so that's really important for both. We've got social, economic and environmental, but also the governance, the administration and operational performance of those facilities. They're both voluntary, largely. We have individual clients for both tools that are starting to mandate them. So for Green Star, we've got predominantly universities and tertiary education facilities that do mandate a minimum Green Star requirement, typically around the 5-star level. But we've also got what we call the Victorian Government Office Accommodation Standards, which says if you want to develop a building and you want that building to be occupied by government tenant, and government tenants are usually your best tenants because they will stay there for a long period of time, you have to get a Green Star rating. So that's really important for us in Victoria, and they're looking at expanding that out throughout Australia as well. And from what I hear, we've also got, in Victoria, we do have PTV, which is the Public Transport Association of Victoria, similar to your PTA over here. They mandate it for their projects in terms of the IS rating, and over here Main Roads also mandate the IS rating across their projects. So that's really good to see that that's now the minimum standard for a lot of key clients within this space as well. Both tools foster innovation and continuous improvement, as we've already said, and from those images we saw in the previous chart, they both take a whole-of-life approach to buildings and infrastructure. What's really important in terms of how those tools are assessed and administered is they both include independent verification. And that's a little bit different to tools over in the US, like the LEED tool. The LEED tool is actually administered by LEED accredited professionals. So us in the room that are IS certified or Green Star certified, it would be the equivalent of us actually handing that rating over and not having that independent verification body. So that's a really important part that we think has given independence from those non-profit organisations to deliver those ratings and be assessed by industry professionals within our area. Both also utilise a reference case. So where you've got some of the more complex or credits that require more detailed analysis, like your water calculators and your energy calculators, both of them under a modelling scenario, you both have your base case, and then you'll assess that base case against a reference case or a proposed case to determine what your efficiency gains are, and that determines the credits you're applicable for. So both use a consistent approach, which is really good. What we'll see later on is that approach is often doubled, so we get some duplication of some of those assessments, which is where we really want to start to see some efficiency in the future. Both also have what we call a choose your own adventure of credit selection or materiality assessment. So you've got the system there. It's really up to you to decide how you navigate that system. Clients can start to dictate some mandates within each of those categories and say, this is the minimum acceptance that we require for energy or water or materials. And we're starting to see that happen at the moment. So although you can select which credits you want to get to the level you guys are targeting, there's starting to be some boundaries around what is actually acceptable in terms of minimum practice within each of those categories. Green Star's also starting to look at minimum performance within each of those categories. So to bump up a star level, you must have a certain number of credits within each category, just to make sure that it is a holistic assessment and you can't just max out credits within one particular area and completely ignore or leave out a section. So we'll see if that happens with the IS rating system as well. One difference that does happen between the tools is the requirement for conditional, or the conditional requirements. So under Green Star, there's two that relate to minimum energy performance of a building, and the second one relates to land use and ecology. So under land use and ecology for Green Star, there are particular areas or habitat types that you cannot build a building in. They're a wetland, a Ramsar wetland, or old growth forest, and there's a few other areas that are being added to that. Potentially sensitive native grasslands are looking at being added to that space as well. Regardless of how efficient or how holistically sustainable your building is, those are being designated as places that buildings should not be put. You should put buildings in other places, which is fair enough. It's interesting to find out whether ISCA looks at adopting this similar mandate that says it doesn't matter whether you meet state or federal legislative environmental requirements, there are particular areas that infrastructure just shouldn't be put if it's going to be certified under ISCA. So it'll be interesting to see where that happens in the future as well. There are, of course, overlaps amongst the credits, predominantly in the areas of energy, water, ecological calculators, if anyone's played with both of those under Green Star and IS, and of course the material calculators too. We won't have time to go into the details of each of those credits and have a look at those benchmarks, but importantly enough, those benchmarks are different between the two tools, and a lot of that comes back from the heritage of the tools and how they've developed. So under Green Star, between Office version 1, 2, 3, and now Green Star Design and As Built, the benchmarks have skyrocketed. It is much harder to receive a 5-star Green Star under Design and As Built than it was under 3, 2, and 1. And I'm sure the same will happen with the IS rating system. As it continues to mature and develop, we'll start to see a shift of those benchmarks, which will mean that those tools will be a little bit more commensurate and their relationship will form a little bit closer as well. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries between those two projects. So I mentioned we're starting to see a bit more complexity in terms of the type of assets that are being delivered under infrastructure projects. But when they were simple, it was really easy. If you were delivering a highway, a bridge, a port, any of those infrastructure components that you guys all know well, IS is there for you. On the right-hand side, whatever your building is, whether it's a hospital, a school, an education building, or a block of flats, Green Star was there for you as well. So that made things quite simple. But of course, the more complex asset types are being delivered, we start to see more of an overlap where both of those rating tools are being mandated, specified, demanded, or even just used as design tools. So here we have a hypothetical asset type. Not really sure why it has a hot air balloon, but let's not focus on that. The main thing is we have a building in the middle, and that might be a rail intersection, it might be a station, it might be part of Liz's rail delivery over in Auckland, and we'll have some sort of a transport infrastructure asset moving through it, whether it's road or rail, it doesn't really matter. In a simple world, we'll put a boundary around that and say, great, let's rate the building under Green Star, that can get a 5-star Green Star rating, and the infrastructure either side that leads into that, we can rate that under IS. Of course, we know that's not really what happens because that infrastructure flows right through that building, and IS also has a number of categories and credits and benchmarks within those credits that relate to the built form component of that asset, not just the open asset itself. So IS really can look after the entire project itself. But the client might say, look, we have a requirement to rate that building under Green Star. There might be offices, administration spaces, it might be such as what Fremantle Ports might be delivering. We might have a port itself, but have a new administration building associated with that. And that's where we'll start to see a double up of those ratings. The confusion can come in that we'll often have two different teams delivering those two ratings. So we might have on the head contractor side a sustainability team delivering the IS rating, and then back on a design team side we might have sustainability consultants delivering that Green Star rating. Both teams will be demanding very similar information from their client group. They might be receiving different information. They might be requesting different benchmarks to be met. So we have to make sure those teams are communicating really closely to deliver on both of the outcomes that those tools are requiring. There's also cost inefficiencies in that we've got two groups of design teams requesting the same information and doing very similar assessments for what is effectively the same asset or the same project. So how do we start to get those two to work a little bit more closely? And that's what we'll talk about in these final slides. A project example where this has happened for us over in Melbourne, and it is a confidential project, it's going out to tender shortly, but we can talk about some high-level details of it. It's a new underground rail project that goes from just down in South Yarra in Melbourne, under through the CBD out to Footscray in Melbourne's west. It includes 5 new underground rail stations. The reason it's being put in, very similar to the Auckland example from Liz, is that Melbourne CBD has what we call the city loop, which is this loop that goes around the city, and every train that comes into Melbourne, regardless of what direction it comes from, has to go around that loop and back out again. That loop is at capacity. So regardless of how much Melbourne is growing, and Melbourne's predicted in the next 5 or 10 years to surpass the population of Sydney, we can't expand the trail network anymore because those trains can't actually head around the loop. So what this project is doing is taking, there's about 2 or 3 lines that you can't really tell off this diagram, that take all of Melbourne's southeastern population into the city. What this will do is it'll divert those off the main line coming into the CBD onto a new underground loop and back out again. So it takes all of the trains from those 2 or 3 fingers of the network out of that city loop, which means we can then increase the number of trains on all of the other lines heading into that city loop. So it's a really important project for us to get more people into Melbourne. But from a sustainability impact, we've got about 20k of underground tunnel and 5 new underground rail stations. 2 of them directly under Melbourne CBD, which is already a fairly congested area that has 5 underground rail stations at the moment. This isn't one of the stations, this is a hypothetical underground station, but you can start to understand that obviously an underground train station is a 3-dimensional object that has quite complex areas of boundary. So if we were trying to administer something like Green Star and IS for a project like this, it's not as simple as dividing that infrastructure up into 2 components. We might have conditioned spaces that come right down to train platforms, we'll have rail infrastructure, we'll have road infrastructure on top, we'll have new vegetated and landscaped areas cutting through those main CBD sections. So quite complex for us to understand where the boundaries are of those 2 rating tools. And that really gets us to a couple of concluding statements of how we can try and navigate this on some of our more complex projects, and hopefully you guys start to see this occur on yours as well. So the first thing is to understand that the 2 tools that we're dealing with here with IS and Green Star, of course, complement each other. They're both pushing for best practice outcomes in the world of sustainability. All we're looking for is trying to deliver greater efficiencies in how the credits and categories are communicated and are mandated to our clients and to our project teams. Energy and water are the two most obvious ones that I mentioned before, due to the amount of analysis required for those 2 credits. So what we'll start to see, and conversations are already happening at the moment, I've had conversations with the Green Building Council and also with Hayley here at ISCA and the group here, is really to try and get some synergies between the 2. So a memorandum of understanding was signed back in 2013 that both groups wanted to work together and try and find a way that their tools can have a much closer relationship and allow much smoother project delivery. So what we want to see is a document that really talks about what we call crossover credits. So where a credit is either equivalent, partial or aligned or not addressed, then it reduces the amount of documentation and analysis that needs to happen to administer both of those tools on quite a complex project. A couple of those have already happened this year. So earlier this year, the GBCA launched their crossover document for the Living Building Challenge, if anyone's worked with that, and it talked about all of the credits that were commensurate between the 2 tools and how teams could get credit for anything that had been achieved on one across to the other. The second one, that's a new standard that's coming to Australia called the WELL Building Standard, if anyone's heard of that. It's a new standard that looks at designing buildings for the health and well-being of occupants. So it's not really worried about energy efficiency and water efficiency. It's really worried about us, the occupants, and our ability to nourish ourselves and hydrate ourselves and get access to natural light and high-quality indoor environment comfort. Therefore, it's quite simple to understand that if you get particular credits or a certification under the WELL Building Standard, that should exempt you from effectively all of the indoor environment quality component to Green Star, and that's what it does. So there's a number of these tools coming into play in Australia, and the crossovers between them and tools like Green Star are quite clear. ISCA is obviously a little bit more, or the IS rating system is obviously a little bit more complex, and that's why it's taken a little bit longer. But the two groups are having regular conversations, and will obviously set up an understanding that will make things a lot simpler for us. The other advice I give projects that have, the other advice I give people that are working on projects that have some of these complex interactions is to really start to plan early. Engage with your client groups as early as you can, understand what your project boundaries are, and understand who has ownership over the rating of these tools as well. That is it.